Hi. Thought I'd put together a few reflections in relation to the tragic loss of Philip Hughes, the Australian cricketer, who's died as a result of this freak cricketing accident, being hit by a short ball. And thinking about, how one might respond in that situation, should you be working in a sports psychology context. And I have to say from the outset that it's not something that I've encountered before. In my years as a sports psychologist, I've not encountered death in terms of a player. I think I've been in situations where it's close, and being with a player in a coma, who's in a coma for 10 days after an on-pitch accident. But fortunately, he came right through it and has regained his career. So it's not something I have first-hand experience of, and in some ways, the response to it. To this kind of event, for me, would be very similar to the response to deaths in other contexts, in similar situations. And I suppose, my time working as a nurse in oncology and working with children in that situation was where I've experienced those kinds of things. And, an understanding of bereavement and grief can be really, really useful in terms of setting yourself, in terms of thinking about, what might need to be in place. And if bereavement is this state of loss, usually associated with the death of a friend or relative. I'm sure you could include pets in there, but it's an objective fact. It's an objective fact, and grieving is one response to bereavement. So, thinking about how we grieve, what we might do. Can be quite useful in thinking about these situations. And I think, first of all, one of the things that you might be called upon to do is just be there. To be there to listen, to be there to hear, to be there to help individuals manage their kind of response to the bereavement. Because grieving is one response, but the anger, depression, guilt, these are all common responses in this kind of context. So, for me, there's something about just being there, being aware of the cultural differences. We spoke recently about sort of the impact of culture. We spoke about it in relation to spirituality. In this kind of in the cosmopolitan worlds in which we live, or which are inhabited by sports, if you like, then. An awareness of how people will respond differently according to their cultures would be quite a useful thing to have an awareness of. And I think in terms of process, in terms of allowing people, providing people with the space, the time to process what goes on. I mean, I think some of the models of bereavement and grief can be quite useful in this sort of context. I can remember there was one by, I think it was a guy called Worden, Worden, who actually talked about the tasks of mourning. And these weren't stages, if you like. They were sort of interchangeable, but they included things like, excuse me, accepting the reality of the loss. Working through to the pain of grief, adjusting to an environment in which the person is missing. So you just the person not being around. So if you think about that in terms of a team sport, and the loss of someone who up until that point was firmly embedded within the team, then think of the changing room, think of the banter, think of all of those things that will have to change as a result of him or her dying. So an awareness, I suppose, if I remember the other the last of the four tasks, if you like, was to to emotionally relocate. To actually emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life, and clearly that has to happen. So I think in some ways that there's the kind of, from a sports psych perspective, there's an awareness of what might be going on there. There is a sense of, well, how am I going to respond? And I think for me, should I encounter it, then that notion of being there and making people aware that you are there, should they want to talk, would be useful. Talking with the coaches about what you know of bereavement and grief would be really, really useful. And I think the other thing, I suppose, is, and this is probably a really tough task, is working with the player who bowled the ball. And one can only contemplate what he might be thinking at the moment, kind of thing. But also recognising that this was an accident. This was, it was that, and allowing him space to work through what's happened. Now, whether he will actually be able to relocate and resume his career as a fast bowler, I really don't know. I think that's a tough one. To have gone through that process with that result, and then at some later date to resume the career and be bowling the same kinds of balls, I think is going to be very, very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but very, very difficult. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really, really sad time, but I really think that there is a place for, not necessarily a sports psychologist, although if there was a sports psychologist in situ, that he or she would be the most useful ones to do it. But someone with some experience of, or at least an awareness of, the kind of mechanics, the processes associated with the bereavement and grief process.